Hello and welcome to Illumining the Path with Professor Douglas Petrovich. In a recent video, I discussed the identity of the inventors of the world's first alphabet. Today's focus, which takes that study one step further, is on how these inventors of the alphabet actually created it. As I mentioned then, Jacob, that's biblical Jacob, stole Joseph's two eldest sons from him, Manasseh and Ephraim, whom he knew would be the perfect catalyst for his own sons to thrive in their new home in northeastern Egypt. After all, the brothers knew the culture, the land, the people, the language, the politics, the system of commerce, the religion, and much more. Jacob's confiscation and relocation of his grandsons was one of the greatest strokes of genius in world history. Their invention of the alphabet ultimately led to our English alphabet that borrowed from the Latin script. I often reconstruct the occasion for the alphabet's creation as something like this. The brothers went up to their uncles and said, "Hey uncles, since we were born and raised here in Egypt, and our father is the vizier, second in command in all of Egypt, we have been raised to study and learn and understand the amazing written language of the Egyptians. How about you? What script do you write in?" Well, their uncles would have looked at each other and raised their shoulders and kind of thought, we don't really have our own script. The brothers, Ephraim and Manasseh, then would have set out to right that wrong, to fix the problem, to give them their own script. But the challenge is their uncles were pretty much all sheep herders or goat herders. They were people of the land. They weren't educated scribes. So they had to devise a system, a writing system, that their uncles would be able to understand. This then was the occasion for the creation of the world's first alphabetic script. One of the things that we're going to look at is how they created a script in such a way that their uncles could indeed benefit from it, read it, write it, and understand it easily. For the moment, though, let's look into the nuts and bolts of how Ephraim and Manasseh created this amazing alphabetic script. First, we want to cover some background matters together. Basically, everything that I'm covering here in this video is a short summary of what I have argued in my first book, The World's Oldest Alphabet, Hebrew as the Language of the Proto-Consonantal Script, published in 2016. So if you'd like to really look at all of this in greater depth, you need to consult that book. If you can't get access to it, the only way to purchase a copy is through my publisher, Carta, which is in Jerusalem. This can be done fairly easily online. Part of what I'm going to say today, bits and pieces, especially the part about Ephraim and Manasseh and their relationship to this alphabet, is found in my second book, Origins of the Hebrews, New Evidence of Israelites in Egypt from Joseph to the Exodus. This was published in 2021. It's much more readily available. You can get a copy from Amazon, or if you want a signed copy, I'll be more than glad to sign it and send it to you. Now let's look at a chronological breakdown for that period of time in which the alphabet was originated or created by the brothers. It was 1859, the year of Jacob's death, that Ephraim and Manasseh moved to Avaris. That's where Jacob and all of his sons, other than Joseph, resided. Already in the next year, in 1858 BC, we see Manasseh's first writing of the standing man with raised arms hieroglyph. If you remember that earlier video I referred to, that's where I discussed the correlation between this strange use of this hieroglyph as a determinative and several other purposes. In 1847 BC, that was Manasseh's first writing of the house glyph in such a way that we start to see signs of what it's going to look like in the alphabet itself. Then in 1842 BC, we have the composition of Sinai 115. And that, of course, was on a different expedition that Manasseh was a part of that went down into southwestern Sinai to extract turquoise. On that inscription at the bottom of Sinai 115, just above the picture of Chebeded, he who was disfavored, that's Manasseh himself, sitting on a donkey, just above that in the caption was composed that amazing reference to the Israelites, which includes two non-hieroglyphs and an otherwise hieroglyphic caption. One of those, of course, is the earliest attested use of an alphabetic letter, just as you see here. Then, in 1840 BC, we have the writing of Sinai 377. It's the oldest attested inscription, just 2 years after that first appearance of the house letter in the caption of Sinai 115. 6 years later, in 1834 BC, we have the composition of 2 inscriptions way down to the south at a military outpost that guarded the curve of the Nile there. That post was called Wadi el-Hol. We have 2 alphabetic inscriptions that clearly are written in this Hebrew script that was invented by Ephraim and Manasseh. 3 years later, we have the composition of the Lahun bilingual Astrakhan, composed in the city where Joseph first settled after he was elevated over all of Egypt. Then, between 1775 and 1772, we have the composition of Sinai 376. That's an inscription that mentions Joseph's wife posthumously. Her name is recorded in the Bible. It's Osnath, and there's no other biblical figure named Osnath, only Joseph's wife. Then, skipping down several centuries, we have the composition of, to be honest, a lot of inscriptions from the New Kingdom period in the 18th dynasty. But the one I'm referring to here is Sinai 361, which, oddly enough, mentions the name of Moses in it. Then 40 years later, at the end of the 40 years wandering in the desert, we have the deposition of an inscription that's known as the Lachish Milk Bowl Astrakhan at the site of Lachish. Eventually, I'll be devoting an entire video to that inscription. So that's a basic chronology of the invention of the world's first alphabetic script. Just as a refresher from that earlier video, look in those red boxes. That's where you see the strange writing of the pear house. Pear is the word for house in Egyptian. It's usually written as a rectangle with an opening for the doorway on the bottom part of the rectangle. But Manasseh started writing it in strange ways. He would write it as a square, at first with an open door. Then he would write it just as a whole square, which actually is more of a rectangle, not too dissimilar from the hieroglyph. Then he would write it even in a way in which the house was written as a rectangle, except that the long sides of the house were vertical instead of horizontal. Now we jump into the creating of the alphabet itself, which relies upon what's called the acrophonic principle. What is that? The acrophonic writing system operates according to the principle of acrophony, which utilizes a picture or symbol to assign a phonetic value based on the initial sound of the word, usually the first consonant or phoneme that it actually depicts or represents. With the acrophonic system, you're either looking at a picture, which is pictographic, which is a drawing of something that makes sense, you can recognize it, relate it to something in the real world, or a symbol, which is much more abstract. So it's going to be one or the other. How does this work? Well, let's start with several English letters: capital A, capital C, capital E, and capital J. When you look at the capital A, do you relate that to a picture that shows you what you're supposed to pronounce? Probably not. It's probably a symbol. It's probably an abstract writing of strokes that you basically learned when you were a child if you are a native English speaker. I suppose you could relate it to something such as if you go to a children's playground and there's a swing set there and you go on the side of the swing set, maybe crouch down a little and look at the whole swing set, basically from the side, it probably resembles something like a capital A. So you could say that would be true. But if it would truly be a pictographic use of the acrophonic system, you would look at that and the word that would come to mind would connect to the actual sound made by it. So the letter A doesn't make the S sound that begins the word swing set. Instead, it makes the A, or A sound. There's really not a match. It's not pictographic. This is a true abstract symbol. The letter C, pretty much the same thing. The letter E, that doesn't make much sense when you look at it. You can't relate it to anything. And then the letter J, same thing. Really not much help there to connect you to some object in the real world. Let's do something for fun though. Let's take the letter E and the letter J and switch the pitch. We'll take the letter E and we'll turn it 90 degrees to the left. And then we'll take the J and we'll turn that one 180 degrees. So the hook is at the top instead of the bottom. What about these forms? Do they look like something familiar? Probably not the E that now almost looks like a W. It's a little bit of a different kind of W. You'd have to have a strange font for that to call that a W, but it doesn't relate to anything in life. The J pretty much resembles something like a cane that an older person would use, or an injured person, to walk. I've used a cane myself, so I could relate it to a cane. But again, it doesn't make the K sound, does it? It makes the J sound. So it's not pictographic. Instead, it's an abstract set of strokes. Now let's go back to that E letter that we moved 90 degrees. Let's put a circle right at the top of that first or middle vertical stroke. If we do that, then we've created a head, and we now have arms, and you can see there are elbows here. That horizontal line basically connects us to the concept of the arms going into the shoulders. So with that, it would make sense if we have, I don't know, upper body, but again, that doesn't fit either. The reason I did that is because we're going to see a letter eventually in the original Hebrew alphabet that connects us to what we see right there. Before we proceed, I want to help you to see a little bit more of what this origination of the script was like by creating an English script. Before we get into the alphabet itself, and before I show you each one of the letters and what's the picture behind it in the original Hebrew alphabet, I want to help you understand this acrophonic principle a little bit better. Let's say we want to create an English script. We don't have an English script. We can't write with the English, but we need a script. So we put one together from scratch. Except what we're going to do is we're going to borrow some of the conventions that Ephraim and Manasseh used to create their alphabet, to give you a little bit more flavor for what it was like with their creation. Look to the left there. You can see a pretty poor man's drawing, and you can see my artistic talent level. It's basically a boat. Don't see any waves of water. There's a mast with a miniature sail there. So that's a boat. It makes the B sound because when we look at the picture, we think of a boat. So we pronounce B. Then look at the second pictograph. That clearly is a door. You see that rectangle with the longer sides vertical. It's all squared. It has that thick dot to represent the door handle in the middle on the right. So clearly that is a door. The word door begins with the D sound, so when we see a door, we pronounce D. Now, as you can see already, there are no vowels here. That's because when Ephraim and Manasseh created the first alphabet, they did not use vowels at all. So far, all we have is the B and the D sound. Now, how many words do these four pictographs represent? Well, there are choices here. It could be one word. It could be two words, it could be three words, not four words. That's not going to work. There's a way in which three words could work, but probably it's going to be two words. Sure enough, that's what I've created for us here. Look then at the third pictograph from the left. That's another boat, it's another B sound. That's easy. Then we go to the right. That is the picture of a gate. So looking at a gate, a person would see that and expect the G sound, or a related phonetic value that's similar that we use for a G, but probably it's the G sound. Those are the four letters that we have, and we're going to have to fill in any needed vowels. So what does this say? There are various options for what it says, to be honest, which actually makes the decipherment of the world's first alphabetic script way more challenging. Oh, and by the way, they also did not use gaps between letters. It was continuous script, continuous writing, and that's what I've given you here. Let's try to make sense of this and maybe what would be one of the more logical ways of deciphering what is here. Our script, just as with English, is left to right, so I left this left to right. B-D, that's going to be one word. Because we can insert any vowel that we choose, we could make this bid, or it could be bod, or it could be bode if we put an E on the end of the word. Could be bud, the name Bud, or it could be bed. Lots of options. Then the second word, what is that? Could be a bag. It could be bogged, like getting bogged down, or it could be big, and that's usually the best option for those two consonants. So if it's big, then we have bed followed by big. Hebrew, unlike English, when they have a relationship between an adjective and a noun, they don't write it like we do, which is adjective first and noun second. They write it noun first and adjective second, just like Spanish and some other languages. So here we have bed followed by big, with the adjective following the noun. Well, in English, we have to switch that order from bed big to big bed. One really good option for what this acrophonic script that we've created could be saying, could be communicating to the reader is big bed. Next, we want to look at the alphabet itself. What are the letters in the Hebrew alphabet? I have some of those here for you. This really is the master key that unlocks the ability to decipher alphabetic inscriptions of the original alphabet. This is found at the very beginning of my book, The World's Oldest Alphabet. And actually, you could download this chart for free from my academia.edu webpage. Let's walk through this, basically looking at one column at a time, starting on the left. So beginning on the left, that first column is the Hebrew block letters. If you've seen Hebrew before, you know these are the Hebrew letters of today. Where did they get the script before we look at the actual letters? It was not their original script. It was not a natural development of the abstracting of the pictographic script. Instead, the Jewish people adopted it during the Neo-Babylonian captivity. The Judite and possibly other Israelite people who were in Babylonia actually had their script changed during the 70-odd years that they were there. They went into captivity with one script and they came out with a completely different script. This is the script of Aramaic, and it became the new Hebrew script. The first letter is Aleph, often pronounced Aleph nowadays, but it actually originally made a guttural sound that we don't even use in English at all. It comes from the throat. The second letter is a bait, as it's pronounced nowadays, and that makes the b sound. The third letter is a gimel, makes the g sound. After that, we have dalet, hey, wow, zayin, chet, and so forth. Then in the second column, we have my projection of what the original Proto-Hebrew alphabet would have looked like. The Aleph letter originally would have looked like the head of a cattle. So a cattle's head or an ox's head is what we're looking at. Then with the bait letter, what's that? It's a house, just as we saw on Sinai 1:15, where Ephraim and Manasseh wrote the house hieroglyph in a very strange way. Now, it's very possible that there was no doorway opening at the bottom. It's possible that he originally designed it without a door entrance, and it could be a complete square. Actually, there seems to be a competition between two different options for how to write this. One is based on one hieroglyph and another is based on another hieroglyph. So it could be written like a full square or like what would be a square, but you take away part of the strokes and adjust them slightly. Those two options represent what that second letter first would have looked like. Let's move on to the other columns because that's our real focus right now. The third column, that's the Middle Egyptian hieroglyphic exemplar. Where did Ephraim and Manasseh borrow their pictures from? Easy, from hieroglyphic Egyptian. At the time, it was known as Middle Egyptian, or at least that's the term we use for it. Middle Egyptian hieroglyphics had an ox's head or a cattle head, and that is what Ephraim and Manasseh borrowed to make their alphabetic letter. You can see that there are two exemplars for the house. There's the standard O1 hieroglyph, which is that wide hieroglyph with the doorway. Then there's a hut, O4, which is a little bit different of a design, and it's meant to highlight basically a different architectural design, oftentimes understood to be a smaller kind of house. Then in the fourth column, I have the original Hebrew alphabetic name for each letter. So the first one, Aleph, the second one, Bayit, because originally that letter would have been viewed in the absolute form. A house, that's a Bayit. Beit is house of. That's the construct form. And that would not have been the first understanding of the letter, or that would not have been the first pronunciation of the letter itself. But it's a house. The third is a Gaher. Again, we'll talk about that later. Then the next column, which is the fifth column. From this column forward to the end on the right, we're looking at how the letters were written in 3 different periods of time. The first one of them, which is the 5th column from the left, that is the Middle Kingdom column. Middle Kingdom being the time period that covers the lifetime of Joseph and a little bit beyond that. We have 5 inscriptions that originate or date to the Middle Kingdom period. With every one of those where there was a representation of a letter, I'd put it on this chart if possible. Notice the way in which during this period they wrote the cattle head. There are 3 slightly different ways of writing it, and that just shows the individuality in the writing of the letter itself. You can write it one way, you can write it another way, as long as the reader sees that letter and knows that's a picture of a cattle's head. It's very pictographic. You can argue one way or another about the beauty of it, but at the end of the day, you can tell exactly that that's a cattle's head. Then look at the next to the last column from the right, the middle of these 3 columns. This shows how Hebrew consonantal letters were written during the New Kingdom. This is the lifetime of Moses and then extends beyond that. Before the Israelites left Egypt, there are numerous inscriptions, actually quite a bit. There's a corpus of inscriptions, especially at Sinai, that attest to the writing of the Hebrew alphabetic script during that period. Looking at that first letter, the Aleph letter, you can see that there are several ways in which that was written. We'll talk about that momentarily. Then the last column, that's how the Hebrew consonantal letters looked during the Iron Age, basically the period of the Judges all the way down to the Babylonian captivity, when the single monarchy of Judah ends and the Israelite kingdom is gone. The people are hauled off into captivity. In this next image, I show you the end of that alphabetic chart. There are some letters that are missing, but this includes the letters Mem, Nun, Samek, Ayin, Pei, Tzadeh, Kof, Resh, and then Shin and Sin together, Sin and Shin, and Tau at the end. They all have their corresponding hieroglyphic exemplars, names, and then how they're attested in different periods. You can see in that Middle Kingdom period column, there are several letters that actually we don't have an attested form of it on one of those 5 inscriptions. So I have to just leave it blank for you. These are the letters of the original Hebrew alphabet, and they allow you to relate it to modern Hebrew and to the progression of how the alphabet looked over time. Before we move on to the identity of individual letters, I want to just walk through 2 Hebrew words with you. The first word is the word Elohim. You can see that in italics. That's how we would transliterate the Hebrew into our own writing script. You can see next to that, on the right of the equal sign, the definition of Elohim is God. Then look above these words, and those thick letters, that's how it's written in the Hebrew block letters of today, which again began sometime after 587 BC. It's written right to left, and it spells out Elohim. Under each of the letters, and in one case above one of the letters, you see dots. Those dots are vowels. They weren't part of the original creation of the alphabet. It was not composed with vowels at all. These vowels weren't added until after the death of Jesus, after the end of the New Testament period. Sometime in the years and early centuries AD, the Hebrew Masoretes created this convention where they were putting vowels onto, below and above, the existing Hebrew text. So the consonants that are here from right to left, the Aleph, the Lamed, the He, the Yod, and the Mem. Those 5 consonants represent the writing of the word for most of history. But if we go back to the original writing of Hebrew, there's one difference. Notice to the right of all of those Hebrew letters in the word Elohim. I've written for you what it would have looked like in the writing system in the script of Moses' day, going from right to left. We have Aleph starting at the right. Then we have Lamed. We'll get into that later. Then we have the standing man with the raised arms letter, which makes the H sound. Then we come to what we would expect next. If we look at the way Elohim is written today, we see the Yod. But the thing is with that Yod, That's not a consonantal letter. It doesn't make the sound of a consonant, a y sound, not at all. It goes together with the dot under the letter to the right of it. That's a hey. And then underneath it is a single dot in the middle. That is a hirek. The yod that's in yellow there is an early symbol to show you that there is a long I-class vowel sound underneath the preceding letter. Vowel letters were created sometime after 850 BC, which means since Moses composed sometime by 1406 BC, there's no way that in his day that yod would appear in the text that he wrote. Instead, it would be Aleph, that's the ox's head, Lamad, which is the shepherd's staff, the standing man with their arms raised, which represents the word halal, which is a verb that means he praised, technically, and then mayim, the word for water. There's a famous Jewish actress in the United States whose last name is mayim, water, which makes the m sound. So there, from right to left, is how Moses would have written Elohim, one of the names for God. Let's look at one other word while we're here, the word boker. Again, written right to left, it's below Elohim, right to left, 3 consonants, b, k, and r, and it spells out boker, which is translated morning. This is a very common word for Jewish speakers because in the morning, they often would greet one another with the greeting boker tov. Boker, morning, tov, good. So literally they're saying morning good. But we already saw that they put the adjective second rather than first. So what we as English speakers have to do is reverse the order. Even though they speak morning good, we have to translate it good morning. How was this word written in Moses' day? I'm giving you 3 options for writing it because there were 3 options for writing. It wasn't until probably very late in the United Monarchy or very early in the divided monarchy, which means shortly before 931 BC or shortly after 931 BC. At that point, it was codified. It's like the nation decided together, we're going to have only one way of writing because it's too confusing to have different options. So they settled on right to left. Before that, they could write in 3 ways, not 1. Look at the number 1 there. That's option 1. You can see the green arrow left to right. The b, the k, and the r. B for bayit, k for kur, which means spun fiber, and r for rosh, which means head or primary or sometimes first, foremost. Lots of options, but mainly head. Then, under option number 2, I have it written right to left as you'd write it today. The house first, the spun fiber second, the head third, b-k-r, boker. Then the third option is to write it top to bottom vertically. The house comes first at the top, the spun fiber second, and the head third, b-k-r, boker, top to bottom. In case you're wondering, the Hebrews never wrote bottom to top, not in any one of the inscriptions that I've deciphered and translated and that are found in my book. Not one of them follows the convention of writing bottom to top. Why? Why would they not write from bottom to top? The answer is fascinating. It shows the bond or the connection between the Israelites and the Egyptians. Egyptian hieroglyphics could be written in 3 ways and 3 ways only. Left to right, right to left, and top to bottom, but never, ever, ever bottom to top. So this shows the camaraderie, the commonality between the originators of the alphabet and the Egyptians who created their hieroglyphic writing system. Phenomenal. Now let's look at the identity of each letter individually. We'll start with the Aleph, as we pronounce it today. Second column, it's written as an ox's head. Third column, that's the hieroglyphic exemplar that pretty much looks just like it, although the Israelites adapted their writing of letters, so they had a lot more freedom than the Egyptian scribes did. The scribes had a very limited way of writing their hieroglyphic pictographs, and they pretty much never broke that method. With the alphabetic letters, though, there's much more freedom that's applied. Fourth column, that's how you write it in Hebrew, Aleph, and there's the meaning cattle. Fifth column, The Middle Kingdom period, that's Joseph's lifetime. They're all written in a way that you can understand clearly that this is the head of cattle. Now look at the next to the last column. You can see that the pictographic value has started to go away, even though in the case of the first two from left to right, you still can see that it easily can be viewed and understood as the head of a cattle. Look at the third option there in that period. This is the period of Moses' lifetime, the New Kingdom. It's very different than the other two. How do we get that form looking at the other two? It makes no sense, right? Well, look at the second option, the middle option. If you were to take away that little portion for the nose and you were to straighten the lines of those horns as they diagonally point downward and toward the center, and then you were to flip it 180 degrees, what would it look like? It would look like a capital A. And that's exactly what you see in that third option of the letters from the New Kingdom period. That, folks, is the origination of our vowel that we use today and write as the A vowel. It originally came from a cattle's head. Then look at that last column in the Iron Age. They kind of go crazy with the writing of the letter pitchwise. In other words, there's no standard for writing this letter where a certain part is at the top and a certain part is in the middle and a certain part is at the bottom. No, they write it how they want. They could bend it 90 degrees to the right, 90 degrees to the left, 180 degrees upside down. Lots of options. Looking at the progression of the writing of the Aleph from Joseph's day all the way until the period of the kings, what we see clearly is a lessening of the pictographic value and a tendency to write in a much more abstract way. Why would this happen? It's easy. It all goes back to the ease and efficiency of writing. If you have to draw a complicated picture of an ox's head and make everything pretty and discernible, it's going to take you forever. Then you move to the next letter, and what do you have to do? The same thing all over again. This became very problematic for the Israelites, and the natural occurrence that took place was a slipping away of that pictographic value and a tendency toward writing letters much more abstractly until we get to what looks like the current modern capital A form. That's the progression of the alphabetic letters, at least with most of them. Second letter, bait, which as I told you originally would have been bayit in the absolute form. You see the hieroglyphic exemplars, how it's written. Now look at the options for the Middle Kingdom period. We have some that are modeled after one hieroglyph, which is a fully enclosed building, such as the one on Sinai 115 and the Lahun Ostracan. Then look at the one in the center in that Middle Kingdom column. That one follows the other option, that hut, which is 04 in the sign list. What that shows us is that there was a competition between the two, and over time you would expect that one would win the day and the other would die out. And that's exactly what happened. Except look in the next period, the New Kingdom period, there's still that optionality. You could write it as a square, or you could write it as that old Egyptian hieroglyph that's in the form of a hut. Let's move to the Iron Age. You can see that the square is pretty much gone. What's survived is the form that follows the 04 hieroglyph, not the 01 hieroglyph. So they're all written in a modified version of the 04 hieroglyph that was used by Manasseh to write Middle Egyptian on Sinai 405. That is the bayit letter. Then the third letter. We know it today as Gimel, but that's not what it was originally. What was it? Look at the right angle I show you as the projected original form of the Hebrew letter. That's based on a hieroglyph that is written in the form of two strokes that form a right angle. Look at the Middle Kingdom options that I've depicted there. There are several different ways of writing this letter. The first one, from the left, you can see that this letter makes an acute angle with those two strokes. The second option makes an obtuse angle. It's larger than 90 degrees. The third option, on the Lahun Ostracan, goes back to an acute angle for writing. So you can see that there's flexibility. What in the world is this letter with this flexibility? Look at the New Kingdom options. Once again, you have obtuse angles on either side, the first and the third, but the middle option is not obtuse. It's not even acute. Instead, what is it? It's basically a right angle. That gives us the certainty that originally this followed the 038 hieroglyph, that combination of two strokes that exist in a right angle. But what does this mean? This goes back to the phase of my research where I had to figure out what was the original word picture behind every alphabetic letter. If you have two strokes that form an angle, could be an acute angle, could be a right angle, could be an obtuse angle. That then limits the field. What I found looking in Hebrew lexicons, which are dictionaries, is going through every single option for every word, wondering, could this certain word that I come to next be the word that's the model for the picture? There's only one that jumped off the page. None of the others sufficed. The one that works is a verb, the verb geher. Geher means he bent. It's the to bend verb. What you can do with, for example, a piece of metal, you can bend an object into the shape that you want it if its composition allows for it. You can bend it into a right angle. Then you're not satisfied with that. You bend it into an obtuse angle. All three of those options reflect the concept of a bend, and they all point to the center point, the connecting point where these two strokes come together. Then you can see in the final column, there are variations on the writing of this bend. Even one of them on the Sartah Astrakhan almost looks, in fact, it looks very much like a shepherd's crook or a shepherd's staff. But really, the meaning there we know to be the g sound of geher. The next letter is a dalet. This, I project, looks like what you see in the second column based on the hieroglyph 031, which is a door. In the Middle Kingdom, there's only one use of this letter attested, and you can see clearly it follows the concept of an Egyptian hieroglyphic door. It looks like a door on a 19th century United States saloon. You have those two saloon doors that you push open. That's what it looks like. You can see the post on the left side, and you can see the door on the right side. Either end of the post would go into a post hole to help you secure the door. The next to last column, you're getting variations of that door. And then the final column, you can see that you only have a limited pictographic value that remains. The next letter is He, or originally halal. Why is it halal? Well, look at the projection of how it was originally written. You have a man standing with the arms having a bend there, a 90-degree bend at the elbows, kind of like a touchdown, so we call it affectionately the touchdown hieroglyph based on the A28 hieroglyph. You can see that it began being written with the head, a neck, arms, with that 90-degree bend at the elbow, and then they took the liberty to shift it a little bit, curve the arms and so forth. The legs, not so important to them. The legs were written, but just in a quick wiggly way, and all of a sudden we're done with writing the letter. In the New Kingdom period, the head gets smaller, much smaller. We can see that it's a little bit more abstract. You can, in most cases, still tell that it's a human being with arms partially raised, making that 90-degree elbow bend. And that represents a person extending their hands toward the sky, depicting where God is. He's above from the perspective of a person standing on planet Earth. So they're offering praise skyward. Look at the third example in the New Kingdom column. It's the rightmost option there. That takes away the middle part of the torso and the legs all together. So you're left with basically 3 strokes and a little dot for the head. You think to yourselves, what's coming next after that? Well, look at the next period, the Iron Age, the first one on the left there. Let's change the pitch 90 degrees. So let's turn it to the right 90 degrees. What do we get? We drop the head, forget the dot, and we don't worry about even that little part of the torso that goes beyond the arms. What do you know? It's a capital E. So our letter capital E is based on this Hebrew letter. Of course, in English, we use this for a vowel, while the Hebrews used it for a consonant. The next letter is a wow. If you've been under the influence of the Germans, you may pronounce this Vav, but that is incorrect and non-original, believe it or not. It was not a Vav, it was a Wow. It made the W sound when it was a consonant. One of the very few early Hebrew words that begins with the Wow letter is a pillar support. So the letter is just that, Wow. In the Middle Kingdom period, you can see that they could change the pitch on this. Look at the hieroglyph O30. The O30 hieroglyph shows you the column itself representing the column of a building. It could be a public, could be a private building. Let's say it's a public building, and that represents a stone column. At the top of the stone column, you would put a support up there where you could lay beams down from pillar top to pillar top to create the ability to make a roof over your heads. That's exactly what we have here. Looking at the Middle Kingdom column, you can see that the pitch doesn't matter. Wadi el-Hol 2 shows us that you can change the pitch over 90 degrees and make it like a spearhead pointing to the ground. Or you could depict the top of the column not centralized, but on one side or the other. Then in the New Kingdom period, it's pretty much the same, but we could lay it down if we need to, especially writing inscriptions or writing letters where the writing goes top to bottom. And then the final column, you can see that there's some pictographic value that's retained, but in some cases, it's very difficult to see that that actually was a pillar support. Then we come to the Zayah letter. The original picture behind the Zayah letter was really difficult to figure out. There seemed to be no plausible possible option until I focused on the lines that make what looks like the equal sign. Look at the second column, the projected original Proto-Hebrew form of the letter. That looks to us like equals. If those are a straightening out of the eyebrow into two eyebrows, then that could represent a person's two eyebrows. What for the Hebrew person is connected to eyebrows? Go back to the book of Genesis. In fact, go back to the garden itself with Adam and Eve there. As soon as they had sinned, God came down. After Adam and Eve ate the forbidden fruit, God asked what was going on. Of course, they more or less confessed to their crimes, and God brought about the curse upon mankind and everything on the earth. Here's one of the things God said, and this comes in Genesis 3:19a. By the sweat of your brow you will eat bread until you return to the ground. How's that for punishment? So for an ancient Hebrew person, they would connect the sweat that comes with work to the eyebrows, because that's where they feel and see their sweat the clearest. If they lived in Egypt, they would be sweating all of the time, with that hot climate. Sweat was a part of daily life for the early Israelites in Egypt. So when it came time to figure out what word would connect them with the Z sound, they chose Zayah, brows, which represent the word sweat, which starts with the Z sound. Throughout all the periods, it pretty much across the board looks like an equals sign. It didn't really change in the pictographic value. Then the next letter, Chet, that's another guttural. With this letter, we have actually two competing forms again. This time, though, they're completely unrelated to one another. Two fully different words. The first option, the one on the left, is a chatzer, which is an enclosure. This is like a floor plan of a building, so it relates to the construction, the architecture. The second option, you can see the twist in that one. Looks like something you could do with licorice. That is a chut. Chut is a thread, so it's used in the making of clothes. This is a very common word, so they chose this common word for the writing of the letter. These are like two race cars at Indianapolis 500 driving against one another, seeing which one can cross the finish line and get the checkered flag. What happens? In the Middle Kingdom period, both options. In the New Kingdom period, both options. Then look in the Iron Age. Something happened. Somewhere along the way, chut, that twisted thread, went by the wayside. You don't see it any longer at all. all you see is the enclosure. So chatzer is the word that won the race. The next letter, we know this as Tate, but it originally wasn't Tate. It followed the Middle Egyptian hieroglyph F35. And that hieroglyph consists of an oval with a long stroke that goes from the long end of the oval, and then a cross stroke. This represents several parts of an animal. Actually, this letter, when written in Middle Egyptian hieroglyphics, was used to make the word nefer. Nefer is the word for good, pleasant, beautiful, or pretty much any synonym that matches those. That being the case, the Israelites saw the nefer glyph and they connected it with the concept of good, which for them translates to tov. If you see this writing and you're thinking tov, you're thinking good. So this became the alphabetic letter. It's unattested in the 5 inscriptions from the Middle Kingdom, but it is attested during the New Kingdom. You can see it there depicted on Sinai 351. Then something wild happens in that period. That's not the only way to write it. If you take that circle and then disconnect it from those 2 perpendicular crossbars, and you take those crossbars and you make them the same length and you put them in the middle of the circle, you get what you see in that second example from Sinai 357. It basically looks like a spoked wheel, but that's not what it means. It doesn't mean chariot wheel. It still means tov. It still means good. So now it becomes a circle with a plus sign in the middle of it. We know that that form won out, that the old form died away, because in the Iron Age, all that you see is the circle with the plus sign in it. It makes perfect sense if you know Middle Egyptian hieroglyphics, but even for scholars who don't know that, they never would have been able to make this connection. That, folks, is the reason why it looks the way it does. Then we come to the Yod letter. Yod originally was not a Yod, but it was a Yad. Yad is the word for a hand. There are 2 competing forms for it, both meaning the same thing, so we're back to 2 ways of writing one word, the word hand. So either the hand could be written with the forearm and a little bit of the upper arm, or it could be written pretty much just with the hand and a little bit of the wrist. In the Middle Kingdom, you can see that both options exist, and then in the New Kingdom, you pretty much have a full arm to it so that it's a derivative of the D36 hieroglyph. It's the one of the exemplars that's on the left of the 2. That form transitions fairly similarly into the Iron Age, so there's not much difference there except that it becomes written even more abstractly in the Iron Age. Next is the letter Kaf. Kaf is the word for a palm. It starts with the hieroglyph that has 2 arms raised with the thumb and then the 4 fingers as one. You see that D28 hieroglyph there in the 3rd column from the left? 2 hands extended skyward, and on the inner part of both hands would be the thumb. The outer part of both would be the 4 fingers as one. So that letter, how is it written in the Middle Kingdom? Look at the examples there. The Wadi el-Hol 2 examples both take us back to the way that Hebeded wrote that hieroglyph. He didn't write it in the standard way, the accepted way, the correct way. Instead, he wrote it as a bootleg hieroglyph, where the tip of the thumb is connected with the tips of the 4 fingers as one to make a circle. So that circle, you can see he wrote that on Sinai 92 on a hieroglyphic Middle Egyptian inscription, Sinai 92, in this bootleg fashion. And what do you know? It eventually makes its way into how later Hebrews were writing this letter, because it's been curved to make it easier to write. You curve that with those 2 hands, the thumb with the 4 fingers as one, into a circle. So you have 2 circles. Then on Sinai 376, we have a variation of that where all we're focused on there is just the hand. It's basically the hand, which ultimately depicts the palm there, but it's 4 out of the 5 fingers that are shown as visible. So clearly that allows the reader to know this is a hand. Then in the next period, that continues. it has already transitioned away from the full arms and the hands that have the thumb connecting to the four fingers as one. Now we have whatever number of fingers a person wants to depict, 5, 4, 3, that represents the word kaf, which is palm. And then look in the Iron Age examples. Now we're very abstract. We can barely see that those are palms. You have to have the background to understand that permanent progression of change that now becomes second nature to the Hebrew writers. The next letter is lamed, originally lamad. It's a verb that means teach. Now the picture behind this is one of a shepherd's staff. What is the connection between the verb for teach and a shepherd's staff? You have to go back to their culture. What were they mainly? Sheep herders, goat herders. So they constantly have to have shepherd's staffs. What do you do with a shepherd's staff? You teach the goat. You teach the lamb. You teach them what they need to learn. Or, as we know from the Bible, you use it as a rod to teach a child. You spank with a shepherd's staff. How did it look in the Middle Kingdom? Again, the pitch doesn't matter. What matters is that it looks like a shepherd's staff. On the Lahun bilingual ostracon on the right there of the three, that one is almost straight up and down. Then the two on the left, they're written in opposite ways with the pitch changed 180 degrees. Very odd, but it's a shepherd's staff. Again, the pitch means nothing to them, unlike with the Egyptians. This is one of the areas where the Israelites completely changed it up from the way that Egyptians would write. You can see that it becomes a little more abstract in the New Kingdom period. You can make it nice and curly, and then that becomes even more exaggerated during the Iron Age. Some of them do look like a shepherd's crook, but they don't have to. As long as you have that curvature there, you're pretty much good to go. Then we come to the mem. Again, this is mayim, that's water. How many strokes do you use to write the wave of water? Well, that varies. Look at Sinai 377 from left to right. That's 6 strokes. So typically early on, it was somewhere around 6 strokes. Could be a little more, could be a little bit less. New Kingdom, somewhere around that number. Then in the Iron Age, you can see that we still have those waves representing the water, but the pitch by now is so changed that you don't really relate it to an actual scene at the beach with the waves going up and down. Near the Babylonian captivity, they add a glorified form, an ornate addition of a part of the stroke that dips way down and then has a finishing curve. That kind of reminds you of medieval English being written. After the Mayim letter is the Nun letter, which once again wasn't originally like the pronunciation of the letter today. This wasn't a Nun, it was a Nachash. What is a Nachash? It is a snake or a viper. This is not the only Hebrew word, biblical Hebrew word for a snake. There are several. This is just one. They chose to make this letter related to one of those words for a snake. Middle Kingdom, there's some flexibility there, but you mainly have 3 strokes, sometimes a little bit more, especially if you exaggerate it. By the New Kingdom, it's mainly 3 strokes. Sometimes you're writing the head or turning the head into a circle or an oval. Then by the Iron Age, you pretty much get rid of the head itself and you're just writing those 3 strokes. So it's primarily 3 strokes and done. Except once again, near the Babylonian captivity, we add that ornate tail on the end of it. Samek, another competition. The race cars are back. What are our 2 options? For the Samek, one option is a se'ar. A se'ar is a hair. The second option is sarach. Sarach isn't the actual object itself. The object is a fish. Instead, the connotation there is the word stink, which starts with the S sound. Sarach. Sarach is stink. Why would they draw a fish and connect it conceptually to the smell of stink? Well, where did they live? They lived in Egypt. Where do you live when you live in Egypt in the ancient world? Along the Nile River. They're not living off miles and miles into the desert. No. You may travel through there, but you don't live out there. Your daily life includes the Nile River. What will the Nile River have as an endless supply? How about fish? What happens when fish die? When fish die, They end up on the coastline, on the shore, and once they get there, if they don't end up back in the water, they're going to start to decompose. And when they decompose, the smell will be horrible. When you add up fish after fish after fish along that bank of the river, all you're going to associate with those fish is stink, because that stench will be everywhere. Sirach, stink. Look in the Middle Kingdom. We only have one example. We don't know how much of a competition it was, but certainly the fish was there. Then in the New Kingdom, we have examples of both. We have the hare that's modeled after the hieroglyph, and then we have the fish. Since this now shows us there's a race going on, and the race will be over in the Iron Age, which is the winner? Sure enough, the fish dies and the stink goes away. What's left is a hare. So that hare becomes the Iron Age form exclusively. That is Se'ar, the ancient form of the letter Samek. Next is Ayin. Ayin is very simple. Even today, Jews will tell you, if you point to your eye and say, what is this? They'll say Ayin. Easy, Ayin. Once again, we come to a word that starts with a guttural consonant that we don't use. Therefore, what we usually pronounce first is the vowel. The vowel that comes after it is a short A-class vowel that makes the A sound. So Ayin, it's an I. In the Middle Kingdom, we can see the pupil of the eye that's added. But other than that, it's mainly the shape. You don't have to have the eyeball as part of this. As long as it looks like an American football, you're good to go. New Kingdom, pretty much the same. You could have an eyeball. You could have the absence of it. Then by the Iron Age, it turns into a circle instead of the ballistic shape of an American football. From then on, that's all you see. It's that rounded form, with or without the dot for the eyeball. Then we come to a pei. This one's easy. A pei is a mouth. In the Middle Kingdom, you see a mouth that looks very similar to our previous letter of the ayin, doesn't it? Very, very similar. So one way you could distinguish it is to write that horizontal line that separates the upper lip from the lower lip. And that's what the author of Wadi el-Hol 1 chose to do, to make it clear that that is a pei. But by the New Kingdom, they really didn't get into that so much. At that time, they're writing that American football look. Although, once again, it gives us that problem of, does the reader take this as a p sound or the ayin letter sound? Very, very difficult. By the Iron Age, they made it easy. Instead of writing the whole oval or American football ballistic shape, you cut off half of it or more and just take one end of it. You make that basically horizontal with a little bit of a curve, and that's what's left. That is how the letter is written during the Iron Age. Then we come to the Sade letter, which once again was not originally a Sade. This letter started out as a sack with a larger circle at bottom, which represents what's holding the object within, such as nuts or something like that. And then the top part, which is the handle of it. This is modeled after the V33 hieroglyph, where you have a sack with a handle to carry it. It's unattested in the Middle Kingdom as a letter, but it does show up in the New Kingdom in those numerous inscriptions of Moses' day. Again, the pitch doesn't matter. The one on the right looks like a salt shaker that's fallen over, but it's still those two circles that represents the letter Soror. So it's a t-s sound. We have this in Russian, similar to that. The t-s together, ts. It actually shows up this way in English at the end of words, such as pots or cuts on my finger. Then, by the Iron Age, we become more abstract. We take away the two full circles and we cut it in half and just use part of it. So it's basically half of two circles cut in the middle. The next letter is the kur, which means spun fiber. It's pretty consistent throughout time, although the pitch is optional. It most commonly has the circle at the top of it, but occasionally it's written either 90 degrees, so flat, or 180 degrees different, so that the circle is at the bottom. Then Resh originally was Rosh. That's the word for a head. So you have heads depicted until the Iron Age, at which point the head becomes a circle and it's like a lollipop. But at this point, it looks like several other letters, so not everybody wrote it this way. As you can see in the central and rightmost example, where it looks very abstract and not much like a head at all. Then we come to the letter that nowadays we know by two letters, but they're actually written the same, except there's a different dot placed over the letter. This is sin and shin, the s sound and the sh sound. The original letter is based on two curves. The picture behind this is actually what I would call a little bit R-rated, so it's not too comfortable to talk about, but it is what it is. This is a shadayim. The ayim ending on the word tells us dual. It's a pair of something. It's a pair of what? Female breasts. That's what it is. The pair of female breasts that are attached. It's unattested in the Middle Kingdom, but it's definitely attested in the New Kingdom. You can see the curves to reflect that correct pictographic value. By sometime in the Iron Age, the pitch doesn't matter so much anymore. It's not so clear. And by the end of the Iron Age, for sure, we come to the point where the curves change, where they go away and they give way to the points. So we have a letter, the s or sh letter, that's written almost like an English W, with, instead of rounded bottoms, pointed bottoms. Two angles are created. That's what happens with the sin and shin letter. The final letter, we know it as tau nowadays, but originally it was taish. This was the most difficult word to figure out its source. And ultimately, I never would have figured this out had I not known Middle Egyptian hieroglyphics. So it's a good thing I made this the first minor of my PhD program, Middle Egyptian and Late Egyptian hieroglyphics. You can see how Ephraim Manasseh wrote this in Middle Egyptian in Sinai 92. In that second column, the projected Proto-Hebrew original letter. You can see the hieroglyphic exemplar, and Taish is the way you pronounce it. Throughout Israelite history, it's always that plus sign. The only difference that you get is the pitch. Occasionally, it's written more like an X than a plus sign, but that's just a 45-degree angle change. No big deal. But what is the picture behind it? Well, on this alphabetic chart, of course, you can see that it says a male goat. But how do we get male goat from what looks like a plus sign? That makes no sense. Here's the answer. In Middle Egyptian hieroglyphics, if you write the word for a goat, this is what it looks like in full form. It's written from right to left in this image I'm showing you. How do we know that? As I talked about in the previous video, if the animals or people or gods are looking one direction, you need to move your eyes in the direction where they're looking. That's where you start to read from. So, because the goats are looking right, we read from right to left. It starts with that plus sign looking hieroglyph, whose meaning is unknown even among Egyptologists. In the hundreds of years that we've known Egyptian, we still don't know what this hieroglyph means. But in writing Middle Egyptian, you have an option. You don't have to write the full form of the word. The way that this word is written here, it's actually in plural. 3 is the sign of plural in Middle Egyptian. So 3 goats shows us that it's plural. Wenedu is the way you'd pronounce this, and the U sound on the end tells us that it's plural, just like in Hebrew, im on the end in masculine, or ot in feminine shows us plural. But you don't have to write all 3 of the goats. You could, for example, cut off 2 of the goats. You could just write 1 goat, and that would suffice. Or, if you want to be a little more extreme, you want to save a little bit more space, you don't have to write any of the goats. You can just write those 3 hieroglyphic pictographs to the right of the goats. Or, and now we're talking maximum abbreviation form here, you could get rid of everything but the plus sign hieroglyph, and that would be enough. If the Hebrews had lived there 430 years, you can bet they knew the Egyptian word for a goat. So in the writing of the word for goat, you have the determinative picture of the goat. But the Hebrew person doesn't need to write 1 or 2 or 3 goats. He or she doesn't have to write any goats. All that needs to be done is borrowing that Egyptian convention where you just write the first hieroglyph, and that's good to go. It's an abbreviation. So to abbreviate this at the maximal level for a goat, you just write the plus sign, and that's a goat. That takes us back to the meaning behind the original Hebrew letter. It's a male goat, just to write the plus sign. Tayish, male goat, plus sign. It works. That then is the entire Hebrew alphabet as originally written in 22 letters. The final thing that I want to do today is to look at an example of the Hebrew writing of Moses' day so you can see it fleshed out in full text. What I did is I wrote here for you Genesis 1:1. At the top, you can see it in block letters written right to left. It reads, Bereshit bara Elohim et hashemayim wa et haaretz. Then below that, and I've written this in larger, kind of exaggerated form for you to see it a little better, is how you would write it in the original proto-alphabetic form. I've written it right to left, and of course, we have to make our rows top to bottom rather than bottom to top because horizontal rows never were written bottom to top. We start in the top right where you see the box, and the box represents a house. It's a house, b, it's a head, r, it's an elef, that's the guttural, it's the female breast, the sh, it's the tayish, the plus sign. So that's the first word, Bereshit. And then the next word, bara. I have them separated with those red vertical lines. There's something very unexpected. The ancient Hebrews, when one word would end with a letter, if the next word that's written starts with that letter, you would have to write the letter twice in a row. The Hebrews said, hey, that's a waste of time, waste of space. Don't do it. They would borrow the use of that letter to serve double duty. So bara, b, r, and then elef, you have a borrowing of the elef, the ox's head, for the beginning of the next word, and that word is Elohim. The Elohim's elef is not written. It's borrowing the elef of the word that came before it, the verb created, bara. You have it written once, but understood twice. And yes, for those of you who know biblical Hebrew, this essentially goes against the rule of what's the Begad Kafat letters. Many people who know biblical Hebrew may expect this phenomenon wouldn't work with a guttural letter, but I have news for you, it happened. It appears in the Hebrew inscriptions over and over. The final word on that row is Elohim, without the yod. Then we continue with the next line, a two-letter word, 8. This word has pronunciational value, but it doesn't have translational value. It represents nothing more than a direct object marker. It's like a flag telling you, what follows me is the direct object. John hit the ball. John is the subject. Hit is the verb. Ball is the direct object. That's what was hit with the bat. So here we have the marker telling us what follows is the direct object. This is what God created. Then we have an article in the form of that man standing with the two arms with 90-degree elbows. That's a definite article in Hebrew. And then the word that it's connected with, and in Hebrew, articles were connected with the word that followed. The what? The shemayim, the cosmos. Shemayim. Ha-shemayim. Ha-shemayim. Then what follows that? It's the letter wow, which here is being used as a conjunction. In Hebrew, the conjunction wow, oddly enough, can mean any coordinating conjunction or any subordinating conjunction. So you translate it last. Let's hold off on that one. Next, another 8, the ox's head, and then the plus sign tayish, the goat, the male goat, and something else that he created. That takes us to the last word. It's on the third line. Once again, ha there represents a definite article, followed by aretz, which was eretz, but the vowel changed because of the addition of the definite article that's connected to the word, to the noun. So we have ha-aretz, not eretz. And you can see the ox's head, the human head, followed by seror, the sack. That gives us haaretz, the earth. Now we go back to our conjunction. What's the best conjunction there? I don't have time to argue it for you, but I'm convinced that clearly in the context of Genesis 1 and creation, the right translation is not and, it's then. This is sequential, just like the entire Genesis 1 creation account. First, God creates the cosmos. Second, He creates the earth. And we'll talk more about that in a future video. Now let's move on to a few concluding thoughts. The world's first alphabet was invented by Ephraim and Manasseh, the sons of Joseph, in around 1850 BC. Their ability to write Egyptian hieroglyphs motivated them to create a script that their uncles, simple sheep and goat herders, could read and write without complication. Their solution was to use the acrophonic system. All their uncles would need to do is look at a letter, understand the word picture, and pronounce the first letter of that word. With this invention, they now had their own national script, which Ephraim and Manasseh probably used to write the story of Joseph, which is the longest patriarchal story in the Genesis narrative. When Moses was ready to produce the Pentateuch, he probably consulted a later copy of that very story that the brothers created. Over the centuries, the pictographic alphabet became less pictographic and more abstract, which allowed for easier and faster writing. It became efficient. When the Israelites entered Canaan in 1406 BC, they brought their script with them, which the Canaanites, such as the Phoenicians, happily borrowed and used their maritime prowess to take it to the corners of the ancient world, which eventually led to the Greek and Latin alphabets, among others. We are modern beneficiaries of this great discovery. In future videos, I will show you how many of these inscriptions are to be deciphered. Thank you for watching this with me. I truly look forward to seeing you next time on Illuminating the Path. If you enjoyed the video, please give it a like and subscribe to the channel. I will see you next time. Cheers!